Soil health, there's a lot to say about soil health and what it is, and this first lecture is just intended to provide a bit of an overview into some of the concepts and some of the ideas, and a little bit of the history as well. Okay. Class is called soil fertility, not soil health. So what's the difference between those two things, those two words? And it's important, there's a bit of semantics involved here, but it's important to understand what we're talking about and kind of define our terms so everyone's on the same page. And when it comes to the term soil health, there's actually been some interesting work that's been done looking at how people think about and view soil health and think about it differently depending on, say, if you're a farmer, if you're a scientist, or if you're a student, et cetera, et cetera. So soil fertility, again, the topic of this entire course, we can think about, or is at least traditionally defined, the Haviland textbook talks about I think this is the definition but the quality of soil which enables it to provide chemical elements. So fertility in many ways has historically been associated with soil chemistry and the ability of that soil to essentially provide the important chemical nutrients over growth. And you've likely all seen something like this picture before where we've got soil is made up of a physical, chemical, and a biological component. Those three things conceptually are distinct, but the reality of how they come together in this integrated matrix of a soil, clearly there's a very intimate integration of the physical piece with the chemical piece and with the biological piece. And each one of these play off each other, and there's feedbacks between one and the other, et cetera, et cetera. So fertility, thinking about chemistry, but what's the difference between fertility and productivity, soil quality, even soil health? So is there a difference? I would say yes, there likely are differences between those terms, and we should understand some of these differences. I will say that also that particularly as it's practiced, and particularly in agriculture, language is very imprecise and used, there's a lot of terms that are thrown around. And so I would say soil productivity, within that umbrella, that's a crop or a plant-focused perspective, but fertility is a piece of kind of soil health. So soil health might be a little bit more encompassing, and fertility is a major part of maintaining productivity. Okay, so again, are we managing, a lot of times soils have inherent value in their own right, but so many times we are interested in studying soils and thinking about soils in the context of the utility and the value that they provide for us. And a major part of that, of course, is the ability for them to produce healthy and productive plants. And in an agricultural context, it would be crops and harvestable product from crops. So soil quality, thinking about this idea again of evaluating or assigning value to what soil is. And so how well a soil does what we want it to do. And that's, there's, again, this is kind of like a subjective take on this, because it's asking an individual to, assess what they think or what they believe or what they value in terms of this output or this function. So we can talk about growing crops, we can talk about holding water, nutrients, suppressing weeds, sequestering carbon, filtering water, all these things. Soil quality was really this original concept. People had thought about this for many, many years before, and but as kind of like a vetted scientific thing, right, sanctioned by soil scientists, it was a concept that emerged in the 90s, and there was a lot of talk and discussion of this. And then in 1997, the kind of governing soil science body, Soil Science Society of America, officially adopted this concept, and it's a really integral to that is a measure of a soil's function. What's that soil do? Okay. So, we can take a step back and think about soil health and soil quality. I view those two concepts as synonymous. Some people do, some people don't, but I don't think, we've already spent a little time about some of the semantics here. We can move on, but, this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of slide here, but, from the Big Bang to the 1980s, there's a lot of stuff happened. Really smart people thought a lot about soils, plants, and human health. A healthy soil makes a healthy plant, makes a healthy human, et cetera, et cetera. How the interconnectedness of all this. Science is very good at some things. Reductionism is, a primary trait of science, but what science is really bad at is evaluating and identifying really complicated networks and interactions, right? And that is, in a nutshell, what soil health or soil science is. And this idea of going from a complex soil to a complex community of plants, and then to the complexity of human and human biology or animal biology, it's that's very, very difficult to demonstrate scientifically. Soil scientists in plaid suits, said, "Oh, that's all hogwash. We've got to, when we're talking about science, it's got to be reductionistic, and it's got to be, things that we can quantify and things that we can measure." So this idea of health or quality encompasses this concept that soils are more than just the sum of their parts. It's more than just, how much biological, microbial biomass there is, how much, what's the bulk density value. All these things can come together to make more than just the sum of those things, okay? So, again, the soil quality concept emerged in the 90s. 2003 was really kind of, in my mind, where a lot of things really started to happen, and Cornell officially started offering their soil health tests, okay? And so Cornell has been a leader in this field for a long time. They broke from this concept of soil quality very purposefully, and they'll talk about why this concept of health is just more intuitive, right? So we can talk about quality, that makes sense. People understand intuitively quality, but health of a soil and the health of a person, it's very intuitive that you can understand that we can measure your blood pressure, we can take your temperature, we can measure a number of things, and those all might be fine, but you still might not be feeling quite well in any given day. And this is, again, this kind of inherent concept of health. And so anyways, so Cornell has been offering this soil health test for a number, for 15 years-ish. And then in 2013-14, the National Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. This is a branch of USDA, if you're not familiar with them. They are really charged with soil conservation and water conservation, and they do quite a bit of work nationally. They created a Soil Health National Division. So NRCS has had historically the last 20, 30 years been mapping a lot of soils. So if you go, we have a national database, the Soil Survey, where all soils in the United States, not all of them yet, they're still doing some soils, still mapping soils in remote areas, but there's been a tremendous investment by the federal government in mapping and essentially like taking an inventory of the soil resources that we have. So if you've likely encountered this at some point, like the Soil Survey, or it's called the Surgo. But this is the work that they did. They do a bunch of conservation work with growers for incentivized payments for growing cover crops, or working with like Conservation Reserve Program or EQIP, where you're setting aside very sensitive, highly erodible soils out of production, or implementing riparian buffer strips, or doing all kinds of things that improve soil and water quality. Okay, so that's their charge. But they said that this is a thing that we feel very strongly that we want to invest in, and it has lasting potential for conservation purposes. And so they essentially created a sister division to their soil resources, soil mapping division. So it was a big move and a big, major statement from a large federal agency about soil health and why we think it's very important, and it's a good framework for conservation. Okay, so it's really, it's not been very long, folks. It's been really since 2014 that a lot of this has kind of blown up. There's been a lot of input from corporations, like the Walmarts, the GMs, the Monsantos of the world, that have decided, prioritized that this is something that they want to invest in. So, we could get into all this. We don't really have time, but like the Soil Renaissance, there's a National Soil Health Institute that's formed in the last several years. There's a Soil Health Partnership, which is a large, again, mostly corporate-driven initiative dealing with soil health and soil health promoting practices. So it's very hard to pick up a trade magazine or even a scientific journal and not see the word soil health. So it's clearly, you could argue if it's a buzzword, if it's here to stay, if it has the sustaining power, but suffice it to say there's a lot going on right now. So health and quality, are they used the same? Are they the same? I will use them the same. We can have a conversation about differences, but NRCS has defined this as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, right? So that's what kind of technically the definition of soil health is, but that's not particularly helpful if you actually think, it's so broad, right? And it's one of these issues with soil health is that people think of it very differently, all right? So again, this idea that everyone's, really into soil health right now, and there's a lot of different examples that we could talk about, but we'll move on for the sake of time, right? So soil health, what is it, right? Is it a philosophy? Is it an endpoint, or is it a journey? Is it mostly about farm practices and management, just conservation practices? Is it mostly about quantifying soil health, about taking measurements in the field or in the lab, right? Or is it just all too squishy and too squiggly that it's just, like, it's hard to quantify, it's hard to define, it's just this feel-good marketing fluff, right? So maybe a little bit of all this. Maybe not. It really depends. These are open-ended questions. It depends on who you ask. You ask 10 different people, you'll likely get 10 different answers about each one of these, right? So you'll have to pardon my kind of cheesy clip art here, but soil health, I think it's important for us to understand it's a young and emerging field, right? It needs refinement. So it's not like we're just marching down this linear path and that there's going to be missteps and blah, blah, blah. We also need to understand that soil health is multivariate by nature. What do I mean by that? Well, you can't just look at one indicator at a time or one measurement at a time. We can't just look at pH. We can't just look at, biological activity. We've got to look at all of these things collectively and kind of hold them, upload them into our brain and hold them there and understand that there's a lot of relationships and a lot of interactions that occur. So we can't just sum all this stuff up into a single number, but there's many properties that make up this quality or this concept of soil health. So, and again, it's like this bit of uncertainty in terms of we don't know exactly where we're going, but there's a number of people trying to sort this stuff out in terms of where this field is going. So soil health means many things to different people, okay? And again, broadly, we can think about soil degrading processes like erosion, organic matter loss, nutrient depletion, et cetera, et cetera. We can think about soil conserving practices or processes, things we get with crop rotation, reduced tillage, best nutrient management, particularly for this class, right? So we can dichotomize what's going to promote soil health, what's going to detract from soil health. But we should all be able to agree on what a healthy soil is, right? Even though there's a lot of uncertainty or a lot of lack of precision in the language that we're using here, we might be able to agree on what a healthy soil is. Okay, so I think most people, this is not going to be a list that is contentious, right? Like, we could debate some of these finer points, but for the most part, people would understand that a healthy soil would have all these properties: sufficient nutrients for plant growth, good tilth or structure, sufficient rooting depth so that those roots can really explore the soil and mine soil nutrients and water, et cetera, et cetera. Good drainage so we don't have anoxic conditions occurring. Low pathogen load with many beneficial soil microorganisms. Low weed pressure. No harmful chemicals or toxins to crops. We don't, going into a super fun site might have really beautiful soil, but if it's got some kind of pollutant, environmental contaminant, then most people would not call that a healthy soil. And this idea of resilience to degradation, right? So these are all things that we can kind of agree on in terms of what goes into soil health. One of the challenges, though, is if we look at this list, we look at sufficient nutrients. Well, what does that actually mean? What does sufficient nutrients mean? Or what does good drainage or few pathogens? We have to actually start measuring things, right? We have to start quantifying things. And the devil here is in the details in terms of how we actually quantify each one of these attributes or characteristics of a healthy soil. Okay, so we'll get into that in a little bit. We need to move from soil function to an indicator. So I would say this last slide, these are all functions, right? So like good drainage, low weed pressure, those are functions of soil. But we actually need a measurement. We need an indicator to relate that or reflect that soil function. So, and I say this all the time, but if we want people to manage a soil property, we must be able to measure it. You are never going to manage cholesterol if you never measure your cholesterol. You're not going to be aware that you have high blood pressure if you never go get a checkup and get your blood pressure read, right? So it's just like we can't be managing for soil properties that unless we are actually physically actively measuring them. Okay, so it's a really important thing to understand. Soil science has been around for a long time, and we have lots of measurements. We have lots of ways to actually quantify properties of soil. Those can broadly be defined into chemical indicators, physical indicators, biological indicators. I'm using the word indicator and measurement synonymously here, so let's not be confused about that. This is a table that lists different chemical, biological, and physical indicators. In no way, shape, or form is this an exhaustive list. We've got entire textbooks that outline various manuals and provide standardized protocols to do that, right? And so this is an important part of science, that this is what CEC is, this is how we measure it, and then you can reproduce CEC across many different labs. That's a fundamental concept or a tenet of science. So there are many potential indicators. But there's some nuance or complexity in this. So Indicators are a tool for measurement. It indicates an improvement or a degradation, or just where you are. Like, are you in a good range or a bad range? So soil analysis, it typically occurs in the laboratory and not in the field. So that's another piece, right? Today, standing here, and not for the foreseeable future will there be a universal consensus on what set of measurements to include. So this is a challenge when we actually try to pick which ones from these lists. We could go out and we can measure all these things on a soil. And it's possible we can do that, but it might take several weeks, and it might cost several hundred or even thousands of dollars to do that. That's not particularly practical. We need to pick ones that are very meaningful in each one of these lists and help find indicators that reflect really important functions in soil and are not redundant with one another. Okay, so another piece of this is some soil measurements are inherent and some are dynamic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. And this is an important thing when we're talking about soils, and we need to ground like what soil health is and what it can do for you. And if we strive for soil health, like we are. So what does this mean? So we have inherent properties and dynamic properties. Inherent properties are like the genes of a soil, right? They're properties that cannot be improved or altered. Things like the texture, the slope, the climate with that soil is in, what it's developed, the parent material, the feedstock of that soil, the depth of bedrock, drainage class. These are things that no matter what we do, we're basically stuck with, right? So what we focus on in soil health is these dynamic properties. These are things that can be improved with management. Things like organic matter percentage, the pH, the compaction layer, disease pressure, all these things that we can manage for. So it's just important to understand that we are never, ever, ever going to take a, say, Hoytville clay in northwest Ohio and transform that soil into a mollisol that we find in Iowa, okay? And we're not going to take a sandy soil from Erie County and turn that into, a really deep soil. So we just have to understand that there's only so much that we can do with the soil in terms of, altering its function and its production capacity. So soil texture changes very slowly over time, unless there's some big erosive event or something like that. But barring like major disturbance events, we're not gonna take a sandy soil and make it into a silt loam soil. It's just not gonna happen. So we have to be realistic and grounded in what we actually can do with the soil. Okay, we have to work within our constraints, I suppose. So think of all this, that table that I just showed a few slides back with all these different measurements or indicators in there. So how do we do this? Well, how do we actually pick what a minimum set of indicators are so we can actually go through and measure and maybe quantify the health of the soil? So we are looking for indicators or measurements that are sensitive to management changes. We are looking for ones that reflect some soil or plant function, right, to make it intuitive about what that is. We're looking for a measurement that is reliable, robust, repeatable, something that's not going to, you get a value of 100 one day in the lab, the next day you go back and measure it again and you get a value of 250. Like, that's not helping, us understand or repeat. It makes that measurement a lot less reliable. And we like to kind of pull these together so that we might be selecting from different functions or different plant properties or soil properties, okay? So then there's so we might winnow down a list of indicators after we do, say look at these 3 things or maybe 4 things. And then we just have this very kind of draconian winnowing again that happens, which is thinking about most of these measurements, or at least this is kind of how I think about it, and what we spend quite a bit of time in my lab thinking about. We want soil health testing to be something that farmers do consistently, right? That's the ultimate goal, is provide an additional set of tests and information to help farmers manage soils, manage crops better. That soil is going to not happen in a Ohio State, university lab. It's going to happen in commercial soil testing labs. And so commercial soil testing labs have constraints, and those we could get into this a little more, but essentially those indicators have to be rapid. In other words, it can't take 3 or 4 weeks to get data back. It's got to be something that you can look at and measure and get data back the next day or next few days. It's got to be relatively inexpensive, because farmers just won't pay several $100s for a test. They're not going to do it. It's just like part of the psychology. And it's got to be high throughput, meaning you have to have the capacity to run several hundred or several thousand of these tests in a day. If it's something like that, you can only do 10 at a time. I've got this machine and it only runs 10 samples a day. Well, these are commercial soil testing labs. Are laboratories that can process, hundreds or thousands of samples a day. The big ones do. And so we have to have, methodology or indicators that will accommodate that will be able to handle, that sort of throughput through their labs. Otherwise, they're just not going to pick them up. They're not going to offer those tests, and it's going to be in a kind of a similar situation where the majority of commercial soil testing labs that do chemical testing do not provide soil biological testing, okay? And it's because there's been there's a lot of reasons for it, but the tests that are offered commercially all meet these criteria. They're rapid, they're inexpensive, and you can do many samples in a day. Okay. Soil testing, we have a tremendous infrastructure in this country for soil testing, right? And it's like easy to take this for granted. But anybody essentially can go out, collect a soil sample. They can send it to a commercial lab, and there's several to choose from. That lab has standardized methodology to analyze properties in that soil. There's been all this background work to develop recommendations for fertilizers, for example. This is, we've talked about this already. And then I've got this QA/QC, but there's organizations, third-party evaluators or auditors that these labs, commercial labs, voluntarily subscribe to. And it's an accreditation of sorts to show that they are proficient in producing consistent values. And so, this is a whole infrastructure that already exists to give us things like organic matter, pH, extractable nutrients, and then we can, base nutrient recommendations on that, right? So fertilizer recommendations are a direct result of soils that are collected and sent to commercial labs. So when we're talking about soil health, one of the things, I come at it from a very applied perspective. I'll concede that. But, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to not just measure chemistry, but we need to also be able to measure soil biology, and we need at least have some kind of indicator of biology, and we need to measure or have indicators related to soil physical structure. Because from a soil conservation, soil management perspective, we need to manage the biology, the chemistry, and the physical piece, if we really want that soil to reach its full potential in terms of function. So And again, this is just about like developing measurements, indicators, a framework so we can measure things in addition to the routine soil nutrient analysis. So if we want to manage it, we got to measure it, right? I'll wrap up here just talking about soil health tenants, okay? So again, this is something that is, very important. We need to, and this is kind of just capping off, some of the soil health, but we just need to do if we want healthy soil, this is all we need to do from a management perspective, right? I mean, it's just so easy, but it's like the devil, again, is in the details. So we need to minimize disturbance. We know that when we are doing a lot of disruptive tillage or plowing, our soil health diminishes, our structure diminishes, the biology diminishes, et cetera, et cetera. We need to maximize soil cover. So keep the soil covered as much as possible. That means with live plant roots, okay? So keep residues on it and keep wind and rain from hitting that soil and dislodging it and eroding it. We want to maximize biodiversity. So we know diversity serves lots of functions that we could talk about, but the more diverse plant species we have growing in a soil, the more different types of carbon chemistries that are being produced, and the biological interactions with those plant roots and the decomposition process. So we just have complexity, and with complexity of carbon substrate comes increased biodiversity or trophic structure, and with that means increased resilience typically, okay? So maximizing biodiversity. So just growing nothing but continuous soybean year after year after year after nothing else is not a way for us to get to a healthy soil. And then this last one is really important, is providing continuous living roots, okay? So not just keeping the soil covered, but actually keeping plants growing throughout the year to the extent we can. So this is important from an annual crop perspective, where some of our fields might be planted, say, in mid-May, early May, maybe not even until late May. And then basically if it's corn or soybean or any sort of specialty crop, that might be done growing and harvested anywhere from late September to up to, say, early November. And even though that's the prime time, of course, for growing, there's still windows. There's a large window in the spring, say from March, maybe a couple months from March to May, and then maybe a month and a half, 2 months in the fall as well, where growth still happens. Or there's above freezing temperatures, there's sunlight hitting the soil surface. And so in perennial systems or in systems that have cover crops with winter growth, for example, these are ways that we can provide continuous living roots. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but roots are really important, of course, for lots of reasons. But providing that substrate, that feedstock for organic matter, and feeding those soil microbiological communities, those soil food webs, throughout the year, keeping them alive and not having periods where there's essentially no new food, no new carbon coming into that system for 6 months at a time. Okay, so we want continuous cover, and with continuous living roots comes a continuous food supply to the soil biology. All right, so those are some tenets. I'll end there, and we'll get into some more specifics in the subsequent lectures.